Have you ever wondered how auditors manage to sift through an absolute mountain of financial data just to find one single crucial clue? It's kind of like looking for a needle in a haystack, right? So today, we're going to crack open the auditor's detective toolkit and take a look at one of their most powerful tools, analytical procedures.
All right, here's our game plan. We're going to follow the exact same path an auditor takes. First, we'll get a handle on our main tool, the magnifying glass. Then, we'll get into planning the investigation, gathering up all the evidence, solving the puzzle, and finally delivering the big verdict. So, let's start with the big problem, right? Picture a company's entire financial history as this massive, sprawling library. You have a hunch that just one word is misspelled in one book on one random page. I mean, where would you even begin? That's the exact challenge auditors are up against. And analytical procedures? Well, they're the map. Okay, so at its heart, an analytical procedure isn't about staring at numbers all by themselves. No, it's about understanding the story those numbers tell when you put them together. For example, if a coffee shop's revenue suddenly shoots up, you'd expect their coffee bean purchases to go up too, right? That's what we call a plausible relationship. But if they don't, well, that's when a good detective, or in our case, an auditor, starts asking some serious questions. And this right here, this is the auditor's roadmap. You can think of it as the master plan for the entire financial investigation. It shows exactly how they get from that first little clue all the way to the final conclusion. We're going to use this map to guide us through the whole process, piece by piece. So, the whole idea here is about looking for those logical connections. You use financial data, sure, like sales numbers, but you also use non-financial info, like, say, the number of employees. But here's the absolute key. The auditor forms an expectation first. They predict what the numbers should look like, and then they compare reality to that prediction. And that brings us to our first stage, planning the investigation. You know, every good detective story starts with a solid plan. And believe me, an audit is no different. Okay, looking back at our roadmap, the investigation officially kicks off right here in the planning stage. Think of this as the auditor kind of surveying the crime scene, trying to figure out where to focus all their attention. You know, just like a detective isn't going to search every single building in a city, an auditor simply can't check every single transaction. It's impossible. So the goal here is to zero in on the areas with the highest risk of something being wrong, the financial hotspots that really need a closer look. So how do they do it? Well, first, they figure out why the analysis is even needed. Then, they use what's called a risk approach to pinpoint those potential problem areas. And finally, they do some preliminary ratio analysis, which is kind of like a doctor checking a patient's vital signs to get the first clues about their financial health. All right, the plan is locked in. Now it's time to roll up our sleeves and get our hands dirty. Welcome to the core of the investigation, gathering that substantive evidence. Back to our roadmap. We are now dead center, in the engine room of the audit, substantive analytical procedures. This is where the auditor shifts gears from high-level planning to really detailed, tough testing. This part is all about verification. The auditor is now putting those plausible relationships we talked about to the test. If the company says they sold 10,000 widgets, do the shipping records actually back that up? Does the revenue they claim make sense with their production costs? They're basically checking to see if the story the company is telling with its numbers is consistent and, believable. Really, this whole stage boils down to a few critical questions. When you see reliability of data, the auditor is just asking, can I actually trust this information? For precision, they're wondering, is my magnifying glass powerful enough to spot the kind of error I'm looking for? An amount to be identified just means they need to know if they're searching for a tiny rounding error or a massive million-dollar hole in the books. So, the evidence is in. The tests have been run, and now comes the most critical part, making sense of it all and actually solving the puzzle. All the clues we've been gathering have led us to our next stop on the roadmap, investigating results. This is where everything the auditor has found gets put under a very powerful microscope. Now, here's what's so interesting. The auditor isn't just looking for what's right. They're actively hunting for what's weird, what's unexpected, a sudden unexplained spike in expenses, or a financial relationship that just completely breaks down. Those are the loose threads the auditor immediately starts to pull on. At this point, the path basically splits in two. On one hand, if the results line up with what the auditor expected, Great, the story checks out, the evidence is corroborated, and we can move on. But if the results are inconsistent, the auditors just found a plot hole. Now, this doesn't automatically mean there's fraud, but it definitely means more digging is required to figure out what's going on.
Okay, after all the planning, all the evidence gathering, and all the investigating, it's finally time to step back, look at the big picture, and deliver that final verdict. And here we are. Our journey across the roadmap ends right here in this box. Overall conclusion. This is the final step, where all the different pieces of the puzzle are brought together to reveal the complete picture. And one thing that's really key to remember is that analytical procedures aren't just a one-and-done thing. Nope. They're used at the very beginning for planning, they're used heavily during the audit for gathering evidence, and then they're used one last time at the end to help form that final conclusion. The whole purpose of this final review is absolutely crucial. It's a sanity check. After weeks, maybe months of looking at individual trees, the auditor takes a big step back to make sure the entire forest makes sense. It's that final confirmation that the financial statements actually line up with everything they've learned about the company. So let's boil all this down. What are the key things you need to walk away with? First, analytical procedures are a super versatile tool. They're used from start to finish. Second, they're fundamental for assessing risk and gathering solid evidence. Third, you absolutely need them to form a reliable final conclusion. And maybe most importantly, they're a huge reason we can all trust that the financial story a company is telling is a fair and true reflection of what's actually going on. So, I'll leave you with this one thought to chew on. We all rely on financial information for everything, from our investments to our jobs. So if numbers really do tell a story, what's the risk to all of us if there's no detective there to make sure that story is actually true? Something to think about.